Anne Hamilton, thank you so much for joining me. Welcome to the Talks with Tony podcast.
Thank you for having me, Tony. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Well, I am very much looking forward to this one because we have been trying to connect our diaries for a little while now and it's not quite made its way there. Hence the reason we're doing the recording this way. And the irony being, we're not even a million miles apart. But that being said, I am so excited for this podcast because we met in one capacity and then I learned so much around you from being in the mentorship space in the world of property. But those people who don't know you, how would you describe the Anne we see today?
Oh, very different to the Anne of 11 and a half years ago. Um, yeah, and even I think I look back every year and see progress definitely. And I will say, becoming part of the property world has made a huge difference to me as well. Um,
Amazing. So I know you're in the capacity of property investor, specialising in serviced accommodation. That's kind of the circles we were moving in when we first met. But I was absolutely astounded by, and still am to this day, by the life that you had pre-property. And that's what I'd love for us to dig deep on because
yeah.
you are a fiance, you are a mother, you are a grandmother, you are a property entrepreneur, you are known in lots of different capacities. But you've just kind of touched upon the 11 and a half years ago, which must feel like an eternity and a minute all in one. So tell us where the main difference is, because this time 11 and a half years ago, what was life like?
Oh, I suppose my overriding thing has in all my whole life in where I was fear, and certainly building up to leaving the cult that I was born into. That fear was so increased because we were taught that God would punish us if we stepped outside. Um, I was although my marriage was in a mess, and I didn't believe in the system anymore. And people might wonder why. Well, why do you not just get out of it? It's not like that. It's fear, and it's fear of so many things. It's fear of loss, because you know that you're going to lose everything. And it's fear of God's punishment, like I say, because that's what you're taught. And it's fear of what the world is. It is like stepping onto another planet. I know that might sound a bit extreme, but that is what it's like. F- from as young as I can remember, we were taught the world was evil and everything in it was evil. So to step into that, what we were taught was evil, is scary. So yeah, was a huge thing 11 and a half years ago. I thought I was going off my head. I just thought, what's the matter with me?
And isn't it interesting that you were thinking what was wrong with you? But for those
Mm.
people who don't know, you've obviously explained that life was very different 11 and a half years ago. Fear was the overriding emotion that you had. And you touched upon the fact that you were actually born into a cult. And we see so often, on TV programs, you read about it in books and you hear this phrase, a cult, kind of thrown around, but yours was an actual cult that you were born into. As you've just mentioned, it was, God will punish you if you live outside of the cult. Life was basically told to you what you can do, what you can't do, and the overriding emotion was fear. So you are, am I right in thinking, did you say you were fourth generation?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, 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 yeah. So my great grandparents were also in
First
it.
joined. How, how does somebody join a cult? Obviously, you were born into it, but when we hear these far fetched stories of cults, and I've watched TV programs, you and I have had this conversation, and I'm like, is
Mm.
it really like that? So, how did it even kind of come about?
I suppose from my point of view, what I think is that it maybe didn't start out as what it's ended up. Um,
Yeah.
perhaps the person who started it, back in the 1830s, it was more of an evangelical type
Mhm.
of church. It was quite extreme, but it didn't have the extremeness of what it became in the late 50s. and 60s. And I would say the reason it became that was because the leader, who is called the man of God or the elect vessel, he was actually, yeah, he was an alcoholic for a start. And I would say that he turned it into what I now call a cult. Um, Certainly he brought in the whole separation thing, and there was no, you couldn't marry anybody on the outside, or vice versa, somebody outside couldn't marry in and still live normal lives. So that I think was when it became, so when my great grandparents joined it, they would have been joining a more evangelical type of religion, I would say. Yeah.
So, so it was very much a religious thing. God fearing family wanted to raise their children,
Yeah.
your parents, your grandparents within a faith. But over the years, that's morphed into something completely
Yeah. Yeah.
different. But
Absolutely.
you being born into it, you knew no different. So tell us what life was like for you growing up in part of this cult. Did you know it was a cult? When obviously the terminology cult, but did you always know from an early age that life for you was very different because you're using terms like that were imposed upon you, like outsiders, marrying outside of the faith, and all of these things that were taught to you from such a young age of you can't speak to people, this separation. Like, how was life for you? Did you have a nice childhood? Was it nice at the time, and now looking back you realize it was something completely different?
I mean, as a family and as a community, that part of it, there was a safety and a good side to it. Um, Certainly, I would say I had a fairly happy childhood, and that can't be said for everybody that's been born in there. Um, my parents were loving, and they had a good marriage. Um, but when it came to going to school, because in those days it was mainstream school, not like now they have their own schools, but that was when it was very, very obvious that we were different. And yeah, something that we were taught from the age of, well, we went to school 4 or 5, whatever we were, but we had to, the reason we went to school was to learn to get an utter hatred of the world, was what we were taught. And yeah, when you think about it now, it's crazy. But that's as a young child, that's what we were taught. Um, and and to be honest, that utter hatred wasn't of the people, the worldlies, as we call them. It was an utter hatred of being different, was what actually happened to me. It was that sitting outside of assembly, sitting outside of religious education classes, and not being allowed to go on any school trips, sitting outside if there was television being shown, not being allowed to eat or drink with anybody within your class. So even at break times, you had to stand in the corner of the room and eat your apple or whatever it was, um, and then go home for lunch. And then you got back and there wasn't time to play in the playground, so you were just you didn't mix with people. It was, and that's what I got an utter hatred of, to be honest. Um,
Wow.
and I was drawn to. I would say I was drawn to people on the outside growing up as a teenager, certainly. But my life was so far away from anything that they were living that chasm just became bigger and bigger. And yeah, I yeah, I couldn't step over it. And I just had to take the journey that you took as a woman, as a young woman, and that was to get married within. There wasn't any other life really for you.
It must have been so difficult knowing from such a young age that there was. It sounds like there was very much a them and us mentality. There's
Oh,
there's us and we're the good people, we're the godly people. God will punish you for speaking to. And obviously, when you say it out loud now, having been removed from this cult, this sect, it literally sounds totally and utterly
yeah,
bonkers.
yeah.
I suppose it's for the listeners to understand that that's all you knew. That's all the people around you knew. There was very much this them and us mentality of, you're going there to understand what we want to be far removed from. You never want to be a part of that. And so, although you always knew that there was something a little bit different, would you say that was where the kind of fear really stemmed from, of knowing you
Yeah,
wanted something different?
yeah, definitely. I like I say, I was drawn towards these people, and that then caused fear within me, because that in a sense was sinning, and I was drawn towards television, or drawn towards girls going out dating and going to discos, but those thoughts were sin alone. So yes, that was fear. um
So what then would a normal kind of day be? You're being sent to a mainstream school, but effectively told everything about it is wrong, only the education, and even then, some of it is wrong because the religious education part is incorrect.
mm,
Not mixing with the worldlies, and the fact that they had, we as, the outsiders had a completely different name. Children around that age, children, teenagers, they're used to going out and playing or mixing with friends, as you say, going out to kind of parties, discos, spending time with the friends, going to the cinema, watching TV, etc. But none of that was kind of authorized for you. So what kind of things, what would a day to day look like kind of outside the schooling system?
okay, so yeah, well, every morning we had to have like our daily reading and prayer, and we would sing a hymn as a family. And then yeah, we go off to school, work, whatever. And in the evenings, we always went to what we just called them meetings. So we went to a meeting every night. Um, yeah, everything was centered around going to these meetings. That was our lives. And then on top of that, and more so in latter years, you were instructed to read what we call the ministry. So that's the man of God's ministry. What he says is printed. So every meeting that he speaks in, or ticks as we called it, that yeah, that is printed, and we have to spend a lot of time. In fact, I would say that the reading of that has overtaken the reading of the Bible in nowadays, definitely. Um, so your whole life is just taken up with this, and Sundays, it's all about. There was either there was 5 meetings when I was there. When I was younger, there was a bit more. Um, and then in between that, you were entertaining each other, and everything was just that community. Um, yeah, it was just
That was just your life.
yeah.
And so at that point, but you've got siblings, yeah?
Yes, I have. I've got 5, so I'm number 5 of 6.
And in those kind of in the household environment, did any of you, because you were feeling these feelings of wanting to, watch TV, wanted to mix with people
Hmm.
from outside of the community, you knew something was a little bit different. Did you and your siblings ever have a conversation around that, or would that have been, you couldn't have had that conversation because even thinking it was a sin?
Yeah, no, that's right up until the day I left. You never ever would discuss that, because once you said it out loud, there was no going back. And they would be on you. Do you know what I mean? It would be would be they'd be extra vigilant around you. I've heard of other young people sort of being locked in their rooms and that sort of thing. Um, so no, and just that just reminds me actually of something that happened when I was 13 and my sister was 17, in 1981, when Charles and Diana got married. And yeah, what happened? What happened was, some dared to go, and in those days there was TVs in the windows of the shops, wasn't there? And so, some of the brethren dared to go and look at the TV of this, the wedding of the century, really, wasn't it? And when the man of God at that time, when he heard about it, he was really, really angry, and he insisted that anybody that had done that had to confess. Um, there's a bit of a longer story behind it, but the essence of it is my sister above me. I've got a brother in between, but anyway, she was 17, and she had watched it in the window of Woolworths.
Oh my God.
Only a fleeting glance. And she was put into a situation with in what was called shut up. So it means that you're shut up to God. And this was within our home. She was shut in her bedroom, and my parents weren't even allowed access to her. Her food was left at the door. Um, and that has happened to many, many people. So to voice your doubts or voice what was going on in your head was just, you wouldn't do it. That there's too much fear around that.
Oh my word.
And I don't believe my sister ever really got over that time. I know she talked to me years later, saying that she was glad that God punished her in that way to teach her never to go against the man of God or something like that. But for a 17-year-old to be put in that position, and like I say, there's a lot worse situations of younger people that's happened to within that system. So yeah,
It's
no,
just,
yeah,
it's unfathomable. And what's really fascinating is obviously, the cult proclaims to be following the Bible, following the word of God, and this man of God, is he a self-proclaimed man of God? Is he voted in by others? Is it, a hereditary, descendants of who becomes the man of God?
it's always portrayed as something from above that's happened, but it has often gone from generation to generation. Not always, um, but yeah, those at the top know that it's a plan from from for quite a long time. They I mean, yeah, in my life, remembering when one died and another came into power was like the most scary time. Who's God gonna elect for us this time? Uh,
So that's how it was portrayed to you, was that God had elected this
yeah,
person.
yeah, 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 yeah,
Question. I'm not a burn your bra feminist, but there seems to be a bit of a theme here. Was it
yeah.
always a man, and were women inferior within the cult?
Absolutely, and still are. Um, Women aren't even allowed to speak within the meetings. The only thing that we were allowed to do was what we called it giving out a hymn. So we would choose a hymn. The Spirit told you what hymn to say, and you would shout that out. Um, so that was all that women were allowed to do, and certainly within business, it's still like that. The women sit behind the men in the meetings. Um, yeah, they're for producing children and staying at home.
It feels like we're talking about, something that, like we're still in the 1800s. Obviously, this is when it first began, but it's never moved on. It's never moved forward. And I am all for, support networks and community, and each to their own when it comes to following a faith. But this is so much more than that. And you've kind of alluded to already, and we will definitely get on to, obviously, you're no longer a part of this, so we're definitely going to get on to that. But I kind of just want to touch upon, because you then mentioned, women's role is to entertain and to produce the children, which was the natural progression for you. So, at what age, like, how is it decided for you? Are they arranged marriages? Can you date within the community? How did you then become, wife and partner to your then husband?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I get asked that question a lot. Is it arranged? It's a difficult one to answer because it's not totally arranged, but there's no mixing of sexes. So even like up till today, they even have the lockers separate in the schools for the boys and girls. They don't do PE together. They're separated as much as possible. Um, and I mean, as a young person, I used to get into trouble for standing in a group of girls. There was a few rebellious ones standing talking to a group of boys, and that was frowned upon. But if you were ever to be on a one-to-one on a regular basis with a boy, as in just talking to them. That meant that, yeah, there's something going on here. Um, and in 1986, I went to my first, what we call 3-day meeting. So it was like a 3-day conference in Coventry. And I was really trying hard to toe the line at this point because I knew you had no other way to go, really. Um, and so I thought because of that, that God might show me my husband. Anyway, so as much as flirting goes, if you like somebody, it sounds absolutely bizarre now, but you would sit where you could see that person that you maybe liked across the meeting, and you would maybe smile, and you counted how many smiles you got from him, and he probably did the same, as to wonder, does he actually like me? So when I went to these meetings in Coventry, I saw this guy, and he was sitting just sort of to the side of me. I had seen him once before, um, and I caught his eye, and we had a bit of that smiling back and forth. Um, and then I spoke to him with another young girl and boy. We spoke as a sort of foursome, just very, very briefly. And I never spoke to him again. That was on the Saturday, and on the Sunday, we carried on this back and forth. And on the Sunday, he gave a note to somebody else to give to me to meet him round the back of the meeting secretly. So he was just 18 at the time, and I was 17. And anyway, we met, and we had about, I think, about half an hour maximum before I had to leave to go back home. And anyway, in that conversation, obviously there was no touching, no physical touch whatsoever. We sort of talked a very little bit, and yeah, then he handed me a £10 note, and written across the top of it, it said, "Love you always and forever."
Oh my word. And that was it. That was how your fate was decided from a
Yeah,
few glances and
yeah. But then we weren't allowed any contact whatsoever because he had to be able to afford to buy a house. And it took him 5 months to buy a house. So we had
so
no
this was kind
contact.
of so was that the stipulation was
Yeah,
you're both part of the same cult or community but from different areas. Where were you living at that point in time, age 17?
I was in Northern Ireland, yeah.
You were
And he was
still
in
in Northern
Coventry.
Ireland at that point. And he was where, sorry?
Coventry.
Oh, so he was based in
Yeah,
Coventry.
yeah, yeah.
And so how did so I'm fascinated by this. I feel like this podcast is going to go on for decades. There's definitely going to be part two, part three. I'm just fascinated by it all because it's so far-fetched from the reality that I know and I know many other people know, which is, you go out, you go dating, you choose whoever you choose, and if your parents dislike that, then you might get a little bit of a telling off, but
Yeah.
ultimately your decision is your own, and that's very evident that this wasn't the case with yourself. So does he then, tell people in his community, I really like Anne, I want to marry Anne, and then it's identified that you can't date, you can't speak to one another. Who stipulates that he
So,
must be
so
able
that
to buy a
that
house?
yeah, that was a rule from the man of God at the time. That was the rule. Um, and then once he had a house, we were allowed to see each other once a month. Um, in Bristol, actually, because they had a massive big hall. So we used to meet in Bristol for like an hour. But again, we weren't allowed any physical contact. We had to be in the company of others. Um, but yeah, this was all stipulated from the top. But before you could make the whole thing public, and we didn't get engaged. There was no engagement ring or anything like that. That's why I value this. There was no. He didn't actually ask me to marry him. There was no get no. But anyway, they have to. You have to ask permission from the man of God. Now he can refuse, even if he doesn't know you. But apparently he does know you.
Because he's the man of God.
Yeah,
Oh my God, I cannot get my head around this. So your parents have no say in it because effectively they relinquish all decision making to the
yeah,
man of God because everyone within the cult adheres to his rulings. And by the sound of things, he can do this on a whim. He can decide
Ah,
what he chooses. He's a
absolutely.
raging alcoholic, so he could be completely, he's
Yeah,
not compass mentis at all, and what he says goes.
yeah, yeah. So
Oh
it,
my word.
yeah, so up to current day. Well, I say current day. When my eldest son. So that's going back to 1986. That's what it was like. It really hasn't changed a lot. In 2012, just before I left, um, in September of 2012, my eldest son was 24. He had a house, no sign of a girl, um, which was a bit of a concern for, really should have been getting married. What was, So it was arranged that his uncle from UK would have him over because they had somebody in mind for him. And so he went and stayed with his uncle, and they had this family for dinner, and they looked at each other across the dining room table, and yeah, they quite liked the look of each other. That was as far as it went. They didn't speak to each other. That was, yeah, but that was on the Sunday. On the Monday, he came home, and I'll never forget, he came into our bedroom and he said, "I found my wife."
And that was
Um,
literally just from that one conversation. It wasn't
and
even a
then,
conversation,
yeah,
one meeting, one
no.
glance.
Then they were allowed an hour's phone call once a week, but it still wasn't public, because he was waiting for an answer from the man of God. Then, no, he didn't do that then. In December, I flew over here with him, and yeah, it was on Christmas Day 2012. I was with with her family. He wasn't even allowed to stay in the same house in case they got up to some mischief. Anyway, we all went for a walk, and they were probably about 3 meters in front of us, walking along, not touching, and he asked her to marry him, and she said yes. But they didn't actually get married for quite a while because the man of God, who's the current man of God, he said that he had to earn more money before he could get married. And I'll say this, that was the most unfair judgment, because my eldest was the one that saved all his money, got a house, paid a deposit for it, and was really careful with money. And if anybody deserved to get married, he did. But yeah,
This just, it beggars belief that this person who is at the top of the hierarchy through whatever means, whether it's voted in, whether, he is the man of God and chosen, whether it is passed down generationally, just gets to decide people's fate, whether that be yours in, at 1986 to the point of getting married, and still into the, late 20
as,
teens,
as,
2019,
as far as
etc.
I know, it's still happening. From anything I hear, it's still the same.
But knew no different. Your entire
Yeah.
kind of connections, your friends, your families, you were all part of this same thing. So without a proposal, without a courtship, without, the usual things that people experience in that exciting lead up to getting married, yourself and your then husband get married. You went on to have 5 children.
Yes. Yeah.
Boys and girls, what's the split?
Just one girl, so 3 boys, a girl, and a boy. Yeah.
So 5 children living, would you say you lived a happy life, or was it that you lived as happy as you could within those means, knowing there was always something more?
No, it wasn't happy. When you get married, you have to go and live where he's from. There's no choice in that. So I ended up at 18 moving to Coventry, and as a place, as a city, even in the outside world, I hated it. I had come from a seaside town, and I just hated the city. Um, and then the actual community, the cult in Coventry was really, really strict and really difficult. I was only allowed to see my parents once a year. Um, so either we would go there one year and they would come to us the other, and always we had to ask permission from the local leader, and I was just homesick from I was homesick, and my marriage was very unhappy and not a good marriage, abusive, in every sense of the word. And yeah, it was just I hated it. Um, and I had all five children there. And in '03, then I had a nervous breakdown. And in '04, it was decided it would be better if we moved to nearer my parents. So that's how we ended up going back to Northern Ireland. Um, but yeah, obviously, the having of children, there's no contraception. So as many as, yeah. And that puts huge pressure on a marriage as well.
Absolutely, because it's not just yourself you're then fending for. You've got all of these, children relying upon you. There are so many archaic rules: no TV, no mixing outside, no contraception, and it sounds like. And I can very much judge from the outside. That's all I know. But from the outside, it sounds very much like those who are decision makers pick and choose which of the religious
Absolutely.
rules that they adhere to as well. I was
Yeah.
raised in a Catholic faith. I was raised in a Catholic school. We were taught what was right and what was wrong. But it sounds very much like they picked and chose what suited them at that particular point in time.
Yeah,
And
no,
so,
absolutely.
did you know immediately? Was it quite early on that you knew as soon as you'd moved to Coventry, it was kind of, this is a mistake. I'm from a seaside town. I'm now in a city. You know, especially because of the upbringing that you had, which was a very sheltered upbringing by the sound of things, to then effectively be ripped away from everything that you've known, your family, your own individual support network. Was it pretty evident you'd made a mistake? And, I'm going to assume that divorce or walking away from a relationship was just never going to be
Yeah.
allowed.
I suppose I always, for many, many years anyway, I always put it on myself that there was something wrong with me. Because, the fact that we were in the same community, why could I not just love this person that had been brought up the same way? But I didn't know him. We weren't compatible even on a normal level. We weren't compatible. There was nothing, our humor wasn't the same. There was nothing that we were compatible, aside from all the other stuff. And yeah, for many years I thought there was something wrong with me. Um,
Is that what led to your breakdown? Because this was a complete nervous breakdown that you had. Was it just decades worth of all of the stress, the being upset, the hating the life that you're living, bringing children into this world? Was it just a culmination of things that led to this
yeah,
breakdown?
it was just a huge culmination of being constantly downtrodden, I think, um, exhausted. There was no, you didn't, you had to get up at 4:30 on a Sunday morning to get the kids up for communion, the Lord's Supper. You had to do it. We were, if it didn't do it, he was like, well, what was it? The man of God had said that if you had to crawl there, you would, you had to be really ill not to go. And yeah. And you were just downtrodden, exhausted, unhappy. Yeah. To the point where you just wished that you weren't there anymore. And I suppose that was sort of the point I got to in '03. And my parents came and because I phoned mom, I was pretty, yeah, I was suicidal, and they just immediately came over and got us, me and all the kids, and took us back home to them. Um, didn't give my ex a choice in that decision. Yeah, I don't remember a lot of the summer of '03 because I was quite heavily drugged and that sort of thing. But they had no choice then but to send me back. That was, yeah.
So was what your parents I literally can't even get my head around this. How hard it must have been for you, having been effectively torn away from your parents at such a young age, then being forced into this life of, being mum, subservient wife, doing exactly what you're told, and then just day after day it getting worse and worse and worse to the point where, as you say, you wished you were no longer here. Was your parents coming to get you? Was that deemed kind of a punishable offence, if you like, by other people within the community, or was it so evident that that was the only option based on you how you were?
It's certainly the elders in Coventry would have felt it was, they weren't told. It was done very secretly because they would not have agreed with that. Um, but I will say, back home, there was a bit more lenience around that sort of thing, and yeah,
It
if
was
a
a lot
woman was suffering like that, they did tend to, it was all mental health problems, and they were a bit more sympathetic than in some places. Um,
and
but
therefore,
yeah, but they just didn't have dad and mum didn't have a choice. That they were not to come between a marriage, is what the parents were taught. Never come between the marriage of your children. Well, yeah, so often they should have come between,
yeah.
but they couldn't.
They were so stuck in the rules, and having been, generationally brought up in this cult, they've seen their parents, their grandparents fall under these kinds of regimes. And so the point at which you then it was suggested or agreed by the decision makers, which are still, for struggle to get my head around, the decision makers decided you were able to move back to Northern Ireland to be closer to your own support network, to be closer to your family. Was that yourself and the 5 children, or was that also with your then
No, no,
husband?
no. That was the whole family. Yeah, that was the whole family. But that wasn't an easy process, um,
No,
because
just
we had
moving a problem.
we had to go through what was called a commission. Yeah, so it was called the Moving Commission. so so we had to sit we had to sit for ah hours discussing why we were moving, because if we were only moving for my family and for natural reasons, that wasn't a good enough reason. So we had to prove that we were moving to strengthen the position in a smaller place. So it was like somebody said to me, that sounds a bit like the army or something. We had to make sure it was the Lord's work we were moving for, not not for ourselves.
But this was all, you've got to prove a strategy for the reason for you to move.
Yeah,
You're coming from a stricter position in the
yeah, yeah.
Coventry part of the community. Therefore, you'll bring back those rules, those regimens. Oh my God. And this was in 2004.
Yeah.
And for
We
those
had to
people
go
who
through
don't know,
so many hoops to actually get moved. Yeah.
but for those people, obviously, I know you in a completely different capacity. I know you as the green lady. You're wearing your green today. There's always something there. You are happy. You are bubbly. This sounds like you were a shell of the person we see
Oh,
today.
yeah.
How then? So you moved back to Northern Ireland. Obviously, it was an ordeal for that to happen. Difficult for you as well, because obviously you've raised your children to a certain point in their home in Coventry. They've moved back then. You've moved back to Northern Ireland. Did anything change, or were you just uprooting a problem from one place to another?
I would say I was happier in myself because I was nearer my family. And certainly, like, me and my mom were really close. I used to go to their house every day for breakfast. But as regards the marriage, no, things actually got worse because I always I think he's a victim too of many things, and that's what made him like he was. But he was a victim in this situation, in the sense that he was being uprooted from all he'd ever known, and he was being put into something that he wasn't particularly happy in, and that added to his stress levels, which were then obviously passed on to me, and especially physically onto the children. Um, so that only got worse, a lot worse, and came to a head many times, I suppose, where my dad would try and intervene as much as he was allowed to intervene, but they could never do anything. There was nothing they could do. There was their hands were tied.
I can't even
Um,
imagine as a parent how hard that was for your parents to watch you suffering. But in addition, for you then as a parent, suffering yourself and watching your children suffer in those kind of
Yeah.
environments.
Yeah.
What were your coping mechanisms? How on earth does someone, because there are people who go through some horrific things in life, and you've been through many more since, but quite often they are situations that there is no way out of. For you, it must have felt there was no way out. The reality is, a different story. How did you cope day to day with that being life?
Not very well, to be honest, and I suppose I did use alcohol to help me. I would make sure I had a glass of whiskey, and I mean a glass of whiskey, that much, um, before he would come home in the evenings, and that, yeah, and that didn't help really, did it? I was under psychiatrists a lot. Um, I was on like the highest dose of antidepressants that you could be on. In 2012, in May of 2012, I don't remember exactly what happened, but I lost my speech for 24 hours. They actually thought I'd had a stroke, but I knew I hadn't had a stroke. Everything was in my head, but it just wouldn't come out. I couldn't speak. And I think, yeah, that was another point of crisis.
Yeah.
Um, in a way, that was the turning point, I suppose, for me. And then I was taken to hospital, and they realised it was my mental health, and they actually put me into what were called self-esteem classes. I didn't tell anybody I was going to those because that wasn't something you would go to. But it was there that my eyes started to be opened, really. But I still didn't know what my way out was or if I ever could get out.
So all of these things happen, and we're just cementing this thought in your head, which you'd had from a really young age, from being, the rebellious teen who wanted to stand and, converse with boys, which was frowned upon, and not even do anything untoward, but converse with boys, which was frowned upon, through to the feeling you're not good enough, cementing those feelings. That was 2004. You moved back to Northern Ireland. Well, fast forward in 8 years. That's 8 years of hurt, upset, anger, feeling worthless, using alcohol as a crutch. But I'm guessing hiding that fact, because again, that would be frowned upon, just to get you through the day. There are people in, was everything, was all of your, when you're under psychiatrists, when you're being medicated, all of this still within the cult? Was it doctors, psychiatrists, etc., within the community, or was this, the one instance where it was allowed outside?
No, it is allowed outside, but this didn't happen in my case. I did just see normal psychiatrists. But for me, and it was what we were taught, we didn't talk about those things. Our life was a secret. So you didn't, that wasn't the bit you talked about. You might have talked about money worries, or you might have talked a little bit. I do remember talking to my doctor about how he was treating, not just some of the things of how he was treating me, not everything. But as regards our life and how we lived, you never ever. That was a traitor. You didn't do that. Um, but nowadays, they actually pay psychiatrists to give what they want them to give.
Oh my God. It sounds like it's evolved so much
Yeah, yeah,
during
it's
the
got a lot
time
worse.
frame since you left, and yeah, evolved for the worst. So we fast forward then to 2012, summer of 2012. You've got all of these mental health challenges that you're facing. You're self-medicated, you're being medicated, you're effectively trapped in your own body, which is your body's way of kind of shutting down, if you like. You go and see doctors. At what point did the decision come? Because you say, you've had your eyes opened, you're now mixing on a more regular basis in these self-esteem classes with outsiders, worldlies. Your eyes were opened up to, a completely different world. That was in the May of 2012
Yeah,
onwards.
yeah.
It wasn't how did it then come about that you made the decision, or at least started the thought process of, actually, this is something that's not right for me and I need to leave?
Yeah, I suppose, I say this often, and I think this is often the case for people in situations like this. It's a life and death thing. For me, it got so bad in my head, this living a lie, this constant battle. It was, yeah, I either had to finish me or I had to get out. I didn't know, yeah, and I came to that decision while standing at the end of the pier in my hometown, that something did say to me, um, there is another way. I had no idea what that other way was, no idea. I didn't really plan, although, it'd been in the back of my mind, could I, for probably 3 years, but I never really planned it. And I think it's very difficult to plan something so drastic.
Absolutely.
It was just once I came to that decision, I knew I could never go back.
Yeah.
And I knew that, yeah, that somehow, I mean, to start with, I thought I'd have to be kidnapped. I spent a week thinking of who could kidnap me. And I even wrote letters to my kids, almost like suicide letters, but not, because, and then I thought, no, I can't leave them. I can't walk out my front door. There's nobody knows how it's going to turn out, but I just decided I would just say, this is over. And that's what I said that Sunday night. I just said, this is over. The marriage is over and everything. I'm out. I'm out of this.
That
Uh,
must have been the scariest thing that you'd ever experienced,
oh, it
you know.
was. Um,
But it was self-preservation by the sound of
yeah,
things, of either I'm going to end my life or I've got to end the situation that I'm in.
but there was still that overriding fear. I was constantly up till the last minute bargaining with God. I was saying, okay, if what I'm doing is wrong, show me. And I went to the communion that Sunday morning, and I remember, I remember thinking, if what I'm doing is really wrong, then God will strike somebody down. Somebody's going to die this morning, and I honestly believed that my mom or my dad or somebody would drop dead, and they didn't. And then it was like, oh, okay, and I can keep going, and yeah, and it was like that actually. Even after I left, it was still that in your brain, that brain conditioning, is it, or brainwashing?
Yeah.
It takes a long time to get rid of that fear. But yeah, when I said those words, it was chaos in our house. It was chaos. It was kids screaming. It was, yeah. I mean, my older boys were in their 20s by this time. They weren't kids, little kids, but yeah, the place just fell apart. But I kept my resolve, and I don't think I could have if I hadn't come to that such a low point that I knew. Um, yeah, and I literally, from the next day, I went. Sounds bizarre, but I went out and bought jeans. I went out and bought, I went out and got my hair done. I spent a whole week just literally transforming what I looked like. Um, just maybe to show to them also that I meant this. Um,
So this was in early 2013, is that right?
yeah, January. Yeah,
So January 2013, and there's so many people who'll be sat listening to this who we've all been there, the New Year's resolutions, new year, new me, and here you are literally living that, the hardest decision that I can't even fathom myself having to make. You've got 5 children, the eldest are in their 20s, but your youngest was how old at this point?
he was 11 and Natasha was 13. Yeah,
So you've got an 11-year-old, a 13-year-old. The reality is you must have known at this point that dad, the elders, the community, the man of God are not just going to allow you to take your children and walk away,
yeah,
but for your own sanity and your own, effectively ensuring that you still live. What did you do? So you moved away. Where did you go?
I
Because
didn't.
all of these,
I didn't move
you didn't
away.
go.
So I, like I say, I told them, and then it was just amazing because like you just don't know how it's going to work out. And so I was assigned priests who happened to be my brother and my uncle. And when they came to visit me 3 days later, they said, "Would it help if we moved him out of the house?"
Wow.
So I was
So
left in. I was in the family home with my 5 kids. Um, and it was quite quick that the older boys, well, certainly number 2 and 3 left fairly quickly, and I understand it was like a very confusing time for them. It was,
absolutely.
you know, yeah. I mean, my second was he was about to get married. Um, yeah, it was a really difficult time. My third son stayed for 2 weeks, and then yeah, I just came home one day and he was packing to leave. He went and lived with my mom, my dad and mom, and my second son, he went and lived with my brother. And then the eldest stayed, and he was like acting like a father figure, if you like, in the house. And it was quite difficult because he kept me
Mm.
quite separate and kept the two youngest quite separate from me. Um, and then he finally left and went and lived with my parents in the September. And it was actually easier once I was left with the two youngest. Sorry, you were going to ask something.
Just it must have been so gut wrenching to know that you're effectively, your family isn't going to remain in the same unit that it has been, but no one's happy. You're not happy with the way the children are being raised. To say that you kind of effectively went and broke the rules and you got your hair done and you bought jeans just shows the level of control that there was within your life from others. You then stayed with your two younger children. What happened then?
So yeah, I went through the courts and got custody of them. It was shared custody, but I had them most of the time. What I didn't do was I didn't stop them going to the school, the Brethren school, and to the meetings. I felt because they were that 13 and 11, like to uproot them and take them from all they'd ever known. I thought they would turn against me. Whether that was a right thing or not, it's difficult to know. I did what I felt was best at the time.
Yeah.
Um, and we did become like a little family unit, They did, yeah. There was things that I took them to that they would never have been to. I didn't get a television for about a year because I didn't want them to be upset. I got one in my bedroom first, then I got one in the lounge, and yeah, I'll never forget when I got it in the lounge. They were a bit cross on me to start with, and then every evening, first Natasha would come in and sit on the edge of the chair, and yeah, she would come in and sit in the arm of the chair. Then she'd move to the chair, and then the other one would come in, and yeah, gradually they sort of she relaxed. Definitely, she relaxed, and yeah, got to enjoy it. And then, of course, when I got diagnosed with breast cancer just a year after I left, they were my rock. They were. They were.
You think you've been through the hardest thing that you're ever going to go through. You're leaving this cult. You're saying no effectively, which is not the done thing. You don't know what's going to happen when you say, this is it, I'm leaving. And the reality is, actually, the fear had held you back from doing it, but it was scary as it was. The outcome was so much different to what you'd
Yeah,
expected.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Was there to then be hit by yet another blow? Did you, given the upbringing that you'd had, the God-fearing life that you'd had, did you feel you were being punished?
I didn't at that point. If it had
Good.
happened to me maybe even 6 months earlier, possibly. I remember saying to a friend of mine, only 2 weeks before, if I ever get cancer and that, I know that they'll just say it's my punishment. But I was beyond it at that point. I knew that wasn't the way it worked. People get cancer. Um,
But they were of that mindset. Was that
oh,
something that was
absolutely.
said to you?
Yeah.
Oh my
Um,
God.
my dad said he wouldn't use the word punishment, but it was definitely God speaking to me. And when they
Wow.
finally totally cut me off in 2015, that was their reason. That was dad and mum's reason, was because I hadn't listened to God. Yeah. Yeah.
There'll be so many people who sit and listen to this story thinking the hardest thing ever and the most difficult part is leaving the cult, but actually it got worse before it got better. You know, the
Yeah.
relationships with family members completely broke down. So 2015, you're then cut off by your parents. At this point, were you in remission? Are you
Um,
still undergoing
so,
treatment?
so for after I left in 2013, they sort of at the beginning there was a bit of love bombing went on. They realised that didn't work. Then they just cut me off totally. Then when I got diagnosed with cancer, I think I know they thought, oh, she'll come back.
Yeah.
And so there was that love bombing and care a bit, but they would never come in. Like mum would never come into my house or anything like that. It was classed as an unclean house. Um, my kids, my youngest kids, before they went to the meetings in the evening, they had to go to my parents' house first to get cleansed before they could go to the meeting.
It's complete and utter brainwashing of such young children. That must have been so difficult for them. Spend time with mum in the unclean house, go and see the grandparents to be cleansed, to go and sit in what you now know is a cult, but they had no idea because that's all they've ever known. So where are we at relationship wise by this point? It's 2015, your parents cut you off. What were the relationships like with
No,
your children?
so really, yeah, the three older boys had cut me off before then. Once they knew I wasn't going back, um, and then I still had the youngest two, obviously. 2015, I'd had my reconstruction. Um, they were there. My parents and my sister were there while I had the operation for some weird reason. It was a big op, and I had it done over here because it was under private health. Um, and yeah, then it was after that was that the end of 2015. Apart from my two kids living with me, I had no contact with anybody really. Um, my dad would answer my emails, and he still does sometimes. Sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes he does. Um, my eldest was still answering my emails at that point. Um, yeah, and then 2015 changed really because she decided she'd been a sinner, and yeah, there was distance, and then in St Patrick's Day of 2016, her and her brother went to Brethren Friends for the day. I let them go, and she never came home. Um, Apart from one letter I've had from her, and once when I saw her in a shop when she was running away from me. Um, I've never had any contact with her again. My youngest, the last time I had contact with him was when he got his GCSE results in 2016, and he phoned me, which was surprising. Um, and I took a card and a present for him to my sister's house where he was living. And then he just stopped answering his phone. So I haven't had contact with any of them since I went to New Zealand in 2018.
It's very rare that I am rendered speechless, as you well know, and you've spent many a day in my company. But there is literally nothing that anyone can say to a situation like that. And me sitting here even attempting, which is, as I say, it's unfathomable, but attempting to put yourself in those shoes, whether that be as a parent or just as a human being, part of someone's life, giving birth to these children, raising them, supporting them, helping them, and for that relationship to completely and utterly break down because you've done something for your own sanity. I'm sure everyone listening has a huge amount of respect for you to be able to not only, continue with the relationship as best you can do with them, always try and maintain contact, but know that for your own sanity, you just had to leave that situation. And this is one of the reasons you speak out now, is that, they've been raised within that way through no fault of their own, just like you were raised within that way through no fault of your own. I just have massive amounts of respect because I can't even fathom it. And this must have been so difficult for you to rebuild your life. You've now gone forward, and I don't want to dwell on the negative parts of it because that it can't be easy by any means.
No,
So
it's
what
not.
I am going
It's not.
to do,
And even talking about it is,
harrowing.
it is triggering. And I do have coping mechanisms where I just put a lot behind, the back of my mind as much as I can. And and as regards to my children, I look on it as another stage of motherhood where, although I haven't got them physically, I'm doing this not just for me, but I'm doing it for them. Um,
I have goosebumps all over my hands and my face, all over my arms and my face, because this is such a big part of the reason you're raising awareness. Because, as you mentioned earlier on, this community, this cult, this sect still exists to this day. It continues to get worse in so much as, I've done so much reading up about it since meeting you, because genuinely the first time that we met, when someone says, this was the life that I was in, there was a little bit of a like, what now that these things actually exist, because the hearing of things like a sect and a cult and this kind of environment, it's the stuff of movies, it's the stuff
mm,
of fables, it's the stuff of books, but the reality is this was your life and still is, in that it plays this big part in your past. I know it's really difficult for you in terms of the breakdown of relationships with your children. They've gone on to have their own children, and obviously, it's really difficult for you in that way. But what I do want to give massive recognition for is the fact that you're raising awareness for this now, because you are one of the very small group of people in the reality of, if you look at the size of the community
yeah,
versus
oh, yeah,
those who've
yeah.
escaped. And I purposely use the word escape because even the fear that you have to endure for so many years, just thinking of wanting to leave this environment, it is something that you've escaped
It
from.
is.
So,
It is. I always like to use that word myself. It
yeah,
doesn't mean that I physically moved out of my house, but it is escaping, and fear. It is, there's three things that hold people in that situation, and it's fear, family, and finance, um, because they're very rich, and that is what's holding so many people. But it is, yeah, people say, "Oh, move on." You can't move on from something. It's not that I'm not moving on. I am having my life, but I think
yeah.
part of that is exposing this. And if it's, if it's not my children, it could be my grandchildren.
Your
Um,
mission is so much bigger than you are.
yeah, yeah,
And I have a massive amount of gratitude for you sharing this with us now. I am conscious of your time, but are we all right to crack on just a little bit,
yeah. You're
because
fine.
we've
Yeah,
started.
yeah,
So
yeah.
let's fast forward to now. You left in January 2013. You started with, the things that I take for granted. We have these conversations.
Yeah,
Someone telling me I can't go and get my hair done. Someone telling me I can't go and get my nails done. I can't choose what I want to wear. I can't go and buy that pair of heels is literally something that I can't even imagine. So you bought the jeans, you pampered yourself, you did the things that, were forbidden, if you like. You briefly touched upon 2018. You went to New Zealand. Was it a
Yeah.
holiday that took you to New Zealand, or?
No, it wasn't. It was literally by that time the divorce had gone through. We'd sold the family home. All the kids had moved away from me. But this was a very small town I was living in. Um, and you would see them in the street and they would cross the street to get away from you. And like I say, I had the experience of in a shop. I saw Natasha. I tried to go up to her and she literally ran away from me. Um, and that was her fear. I don't hold any judgment on her. That's her own fear. Um, and things just got, yeah, I got low. I got really low. I didn't, I didn't, something I have struggled with is making friends. And I didn't have anybody that I could really confide in. I felt very alone. Um, and there is Facebook groups of ex cult members, and I'm not one who normally puts my emotions on Facebook, but I did. um, I think I said something like, "I need an adventure to get away from all this." And I got a phone call from some of the ex cult members in New Zealand, and they said, "Get on a plane and get out here." And I did the next week. Yeah, that's how I ended up in New Zealand.
This is also testament to the person that you were and still are, but that was buried so deep inside of you by other people's, control, judgment, fears from a really young age of being, the 13-year-old wanting to go to the discos or wanting to watch TV
Yeah,
and never being able to live that out. You then have the opportunity then in 2018 to kind of go, okay, I'm going to do this. And things changed for you quite dramatically then. So tell us what happened in 2018 in New Zealand.
yeah. So the first 6 months, I said, yeah, the ex cult community there were like really kind to me, and I spent time at their houses and that, and yeah, they were really really kind to me. But after 6 months, I sort of felt I wanted to go and explore myself a bit more, and so yeah, I started traveling a bit, and I went to the South Island, and I went on Tinder.
Which must have been the scariest thing ever because this
Oh,
is worlds apart from what you've known, You
I was,
didn't even date. You didn't even, get invited to you didn't even get proposed to. It was just like natural progression. So worlds apart, here you are on Tinder
yeah,
looking for.
I'd been quite early on when I left. I did go on dating sites, and people say to me, "Why would you do that after like such a bad marriage?" And I know why. It was my only way of making friends. I didn't know anybody in the outside world, and that was how I got to know people. But yeah, I went on Tinder in New Zealand, and Dan had happened to land in New Zealand, getting out of a long marriage just the week before I went on Tinder. And yeah, he happened to be on Tinder.
Do you believe in
We
fate?
swiped right. Yeah. Well, he said if it wasn't me, it was the sheep. So
And knowing Dan, that's exactly something that he would say. So your whole world changed then. You've gone from being part of this cult, being, told what to do and what not to do, suffering massively with your mental health, all of the things that we've previously talked about, to then trying to make friends, exploring life, literally up in sticks and going to the other side of the world. You've met your now, and you did this a little bit earlier on. So here we see your gorgeous ring because you are now engaged to be married. You are, living life, loving life, building successful businesses in the position of where you are now. What is life like for you now?
oh yeah, it's poles apart. So I mean, don't get me wrong, building a business is stressful, isn't it? But
Yeah,
it's
but in comparison to what you've been through.
I always wanted to. I've always had that career entrepreneurial spirit within me, which has never been allowed to be. And so that to be able to do that without restraint is really good. And obviously, yeah, Dan in my life. well, yeah.
Are you happy?
Yes, I'm happy. I'm very happy. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to getting married. And yeah, I didn't think I'd ever get married, but I did. I did always say about him, if he asked me, I'd say yes. So, and
Proving to you that
he
life.
was so sure he wasn't going to get married that he had torn up his decree absolute,
Oh.
and we've had great trouble trying to get a copy of it because he can't get married without it.
Oh my word.
Anyway, it's all right. We got it today, finally.
Yay! What a fabulous thing to celebrate. See, we got a first on this as well. God, it's genuinely, from someone who only ever met you as the Anne that you can see here, and those people who are listening to the podcast will see the smiley face and hear, that this
Yeah.
is me, and you've got this amazing outlook on life. Is that everyone's got a story, but I don't think I've ever met anyone with a story as unique as yours. And so this is about giving hope, exposing what you've been through to showcase what's possible to those other people who are maybe the you of, the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, who maybe felt trapped, maybe currently they are in there. What piece of advice would you give to anyone? Because it's not just people who are in a cult, this is kind of a very extreme version, but there are undoubtedly people right now who are listening to this who feel in some way trapped, stuck, or under those three F's that you were talking
Yeah.
about: financially dependent on someone, family base making decisions for them, or that fear is holding them back. What advice would you give to anyone who is currently suffering?
Just take that step. And I know, there'll be times after you've taken the step where you'll think, have I done the right thing? Because a lot, it's not a smooth ride. It sure isn't a smooth ride. But then you just look back where you came from, and that's what makes all the difference, and that's what keeps you going.
Your
And
outlook on life is second to none. Um, I ask all of my guests the same question towards the end of a podcast, which is, what is the one question you've never been asked that you think you would love to be asked? Or
oh,
what is the one subject matter people don't talk about that you think is really important?
ooh, oh, that's a really difficult one.
That's the purpose of it. It's twofold, because sometimes people come out with some gold and other times I throw you on the spot. And because of that, it means we get to do a round two and follow up the podcast.
Oh, right. Yeah, because now I've got to think about it.
With that being said, I have absolutely loved just over an hour that we've shared together. There is still so much more that I would love to explore. I know you've got some really exciting things up and coming. You're going to be sharing, your story with as many people as possible. So with that being said, will you be coming back on the podcast?
Yes, I'll come back on the podcast.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the time we've shared this evening. For those who've never met you before, now you get to see the happy smiley face of what is lovingly referred to as the Green Lady, Anne
It's the
Hamilton.
green
And I want to
lady.
say, the Green Lady. And I want to say a huge thank you for sharing this with us. I can't wait to see you on the next one. Thank you so much.
No, thank you, Tony. Thank you.